As someone that teaches a course on urban education policy, I must assume then that there is something unique about urban education. Let me give a little bit of framework to that. I think much of what we look at is the challenge that poverty poses. And there's a poverty issue in rural areas as much as there is in urban areas. It's a different kind of situation. So poverty in and of itself creates educational challenges. How education enriches the home environment, all the responsibilities that fall on children at an early age if they're growing up in a lower income community, taking care of siblings, taking care of elderly relatives, and some of the problems that poses in terms of regular attendance. And we find in the research that children from lower income homes arrive at school lower vocabularies, which then takes them years to try to catch up. And then you throw in English as a second language, and it all becomes much more complex to teach children that come out of poor environments, whether urban or rural. But what makes urban, I think, poverty even more of a big challenge is the concentration. You have so many children in lower income communities that end up being educated together. You throw the issue of race into it and our history of segregation, and you end up with city schools, very large schools, 90% children of color, 90% children on free and reduced price lunch. And this is just an incredible concentration of the same kind of poverty problems that we saw in rural areas as well. So that's the kind of thing that I think distinguishes cities. And then on top of that, you have a problem called, as an example, mobility. They start the school year with their mother, they go to their aunts, then they go to their grandmothers. In any given school year, they may be in 4 or 5 different schools. And there are schools in Memphis, for example, where the children that start the school year, 75% will be different children that end the school year. That's an incredible issue when you're trying to keep track of these kids and gauge their progress and so on. So these are urban educational problems that help distinguish, I think, this field from just education in general.
Yeah, just to build on that, right? I mean, urban is so overcoded. Urban stands in for so many things. When you say urban education, there's a whole host of frames that you're conjuring, really depending on your interlocutor, right? And depending on the frame of the conversation you're having. So sometimes I like to just simplify it. Urban means city. So the difference between urban education and rural education is that you're in a big city if you're in urban education, and you're in a small city if you're in rural education. Rural schools tend to be more homogenous. And while we're seeing greater influxes, particularly of Latinx students, of students whose first language or home language isn't English, those communities still tend to be clustered. Even if I have a rural school where I have a large number of English learners or a large number of Latinx students, chances are that population is still going to be relatively homogenous when I compare that to an urban school context, which is going to have a whole lot more diversity. Racial diversity, I would hope, but also all kinds of different class distinctions. So cities are going to have folks who live at every possible social class level that rural communities typically aren't going to have as much class diversity in terms of gender expression, in terms of sexual identity and orientation, but then also in terms of what kinds of things are around the school, right? Too often we think about schools as these kinds of vacuums, right? And the school population is the population, kind of without regard to the other kinds of things that are in students' lives. And so urban schools, right, are going to have all of those hallmarks of cities, right? They're going to be bustling. There's going to be busyness. There's going to be public transit. There's things like museums. Urban areas are rich with resources, but in terms of who has access, we still see all kinds of unevenness and inequity in those spaces. But when I think about urban education, what are we talking about? We're talking about school in cities. That's what urban education means.
Some people, when they hear urban, they think poor, right? And we know that there's a whole variety of socioeconomic people that live in cities. What has happened is a lot of the children of the middle and upper class parents don't go to public schools. Right. And that falls in a whole context, a historical context, segregation and busing and suburbanization and so on. Urban public education seems to have developed into public schools for low-income children of color. And that's not universally true. There are some public schools that do attract wealthier children. But overwhelmingly, you look at the numbers in Chicago, in New York, in Memphis, in Birmingham, whatever, you're finding that the public schools in the city context, overwhelmingly children of color, overwhelmingly children on free and reduced price loans.